What happens when a prince walks into America's most trusted morning show and unleashes a tirade so shocking, so unhinged, that producers had no choice but to pull the plug? In just 37 seconds, Prince Harry went from royal guest to escorted off set in what insiders are calling the most dramatic meltdown in morning television history. Make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because we're pulling back the curtain on royalty's dark side, exposing entitled celebrities and their shocking behavior the cameras never showed you. We've got the raw footage they don't want you to see, and you won't want to miss a single reveal. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on this outrageous behavior, because what you're about to hear will leave you speechless. The morning started like any other at the Good Morning America studios in New York City. George Stephanopoulos, the veteran journalist known for his calm demeanor and tough but fair questioning, was preparing for what should have been a straightforward interview. Prince Harry had been booked to discuss his latest charitable initiatives and his life in America. It was meant to be friendly, promotional, easy, but from the moment the prince sat down in that chair, something felt off. George opened with a warm smile, extending his hand for a handshake. "Prince Harry, welcome to Good Morning America. It's great to have you here with us this morning." Harry barely glanced at George's hand before sitting down, adjusting his microphone with visible irritation. "Let's just get this over with," he muttered, loud enough for the crew to hear. George, ever the professional, maintained his composure. "Well, we're excited to talk with you. I know our viewers have been looking forward to this. You've been living in California now for several years. How has that transition been for you and your family?" It was a softball question, the kind any seasoned guest could knock out of the park. But Harry's response was cold. "You know, George, I'm not here to talk about transitions or feel-good stories. I'm here because my publicist said I had to be." There was an uncomfortable pause. The studio audience, small but present, shifted in their seats. George's smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered. "I see. Well, we certainly appreciate you making the time. Perhaps we could talk about your charity work? I understand you've been involved with several organizations supporting veterans and mental health." Harry leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Do you really care about that, George? Or are you just going through your little script because that's what you do every morning? Ask the same boring questions, get the same boring answers?" George maintained his professionalism, though viewers could see a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "I can assure you, we're genuinely interested in the work you're doing. Mental health awareness is incredibly important, and your platform could help a lot of people." "My platform," Harry repeated, laughing bitterly. "Everyone wants to talk about my platform. You know what my platform is? It's being constantly judged by people like you, who sit in your comfortable studio chairs and act like you understand what it's like to live under a microscope." The tension in the studio was thick enough to cut. George cleared his throat, trying to steer the interview back on track. "I think many people can relate to feeling judged or misunderstood. That's actually something that connects you to everyday people. Your openness about mental health struggles has helped normalize those conversations." "Don't patronize me," Harry snapped, leaning forward suddenly. "You don't know anything about my struggles. You sit here every morning, reading from a teleprompter, collecting your paycheck, and you think that qualifies you to analyze my life?" George's expression remained calm, but his voice took on a slightly firmer tone. "Harry, I'm not trying to analyze your life. I'm simply trying to have a conversation. That's what we agreed to when you accepted this interview." "What we agreed to?" Harry's voice rose. "I didn't agree to anything. I was told I had to come here, smile for the cameras, play the good little prince so people will buy whatever it is I'm supposed to be selling this week." By now, the producers in the control room were frantically discussing whether to cut to commercial. George could see the red light on the camera, indicating they were still live. Millions of Americans were watching this unfold in real time. George took a deep breath. "I understand that being in the public eye comes with tremendous pressure, but Harry, you're a guest on this program. Our viewers tune in expecting a respectful conversation. If there's something specific you'd like to discuss, I'm all ears." Harry stood up abruptly, his microphone cord yanking tight. "Respectful? You want to talk about respect? How about the respect of not being ambushed with questions designed to make me look like some charity case who needs America's pity?" "Nobody's trying to make you look like anything," George said, his voice steady but firmer now. "The questions I've asked have been straightforward and fair. If you're not comfortable answering them, that's fine, but I don't think attacking me or this program is justified." "Justified?" Harry's face flushed red. "You people are all the same. You pretend to be on our side, act all sympathetic, but the moment we show any real emotion, any real humanity, you turn on us. You're just another tabloid journalist in a fancy suit." That comment visibly struck a nerve. George Stephanopoulos had spent decades building a reputation as a serious journalist. A former political advisor turned respected news anchor. Being compared to a tabloid reporter was a low blow, and everyone in the studio knew it. George's jaw tightened, but his response was measured. "Harry, I've been in journalism for over 30 years. I've interviewed presidents, world leaders, and yes, members of royal families. I've never ambushed anyone, and I certainly haven't done that to you today. If you're upset about something, we can discuss it like adults, but I won't sit here and be disrespected for simply doing my job." The audience was dead silent. You could hear someone's phone buzz in the back row. Harry stood there, breathing heavily, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Your job," Harry said slowly, venom dripping from every word. "Your job is to tear people down for ratings. That's all this is. You don't care about mental health or charity work or any of it. You just want a good soundbite you can play on repeat for the next week." George remained seated, looking up at Harry with a mixture of concern and disappointment. "That's simply not true, and I think you know that. We invited you here to give you a platform to talk about the things that matter to you. If that's not what you want to do, then perhaps this interview should end." "Oh, now you want to end it?" Harry laughed harshly. "Of course you do, because I'm not playing along with your little game. I'm not giving you the sound bites you want. I'm not being the grateful prince who's just so thankful to be on American television." A producer stepped onto the set, whispering something to George. He nodded slightly, never taking his eyes off Harry. "Harry, I'm going to suggest we take a break. Maybe we can reset and continue this conversation when everyone's had a moment to breathe." "I don't need a moment to breathe," Harry shouted, his voice echoing through the studio. "I need people like you to stop pretending you're better than everyone else. You sit up there on your high horse, judging everyone who comes through that door, acting like you're some moral authority." The audience gasped. Several people in the front row looked genuinely shocked. George stood up now, his 6-foot frame meeting Harry's eye to eye. "That's enough, George," said quietly but firmly. "You're clearly dealing with something that has nothing to do with this interview or this program. I've tried to be respectful. I've tried to give you space to express yourself, but I will not allow you to continue disrupting this broadcast and insulting our team." Harry took a step closer to George, close enough that security officers stationed near the exits tensed up. "You will not allow? Who do you think you are? Do you know who I am?" And there it was, the 4 words that would become the defining moment of the entire incident. "Do you know who I am?" The ultimate entitled celebrity cliché, delivered with complete sincerity by someone who seemed to have lost all self-awareness. George didn't flinch. "Yes, Harry, I know exactly who you are. You're a guest on this program who has spent the last several minutes being aggressive and disrespectful for no apparent reason. And regardless of your title or your background, that behavior is unacceptable." Harry's face went from red to nearly purple. "Unacceptable? I'll tell you what's unacceptable. It's unacceptable that I have to sit here and be interrogated by someone who's never lived a day in my shoes. You have no idea what it's like to have every move analyzed, every word twisted, every relationship destroyed by people like you. People like me?" George's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it now. "Harry, I've been nothing but professional with you. I asked you about your charity work and your life in America. Those aren't gotcha questions. Those aren't attacks. If you're projecting your frustrations with the media onto me, that's not fair, and it's not right." By this point, 2 security officers had moved closer to the set. The producer was making frantic cut motions with his hands. But the cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of this spectacular implosion. Harry pointed a finger directly at George's face. "Don't you dare tell me what's fair. Fair would be being left alone. Fair would be being treated like a human being instead of a circus act. Fair would be people like you acknowledging that you've built entire careers off the backs of people like me." George gently pushed Harry's hand away from his face, his expression now showing genuine concern mixed with frustration. "Harry, you need to step back right now. This conversation is over. I'm asking you politely to leave the set." "You're asking me to leave?" Harry's voice cracked with incredulity. "You're kicking me off? Do you have any idea what kind of backlash you're going to face? Do you understand who I am and what I can do?" There it was again, the threats, the appeals to status, the complete lack of self-awareness. George shook his head slowly. "What you can do? Harry, the only person who's done anything here today is you. You've come onto this program, refused to engage in good faith, attacked me personally, and now you're making threats. Security? Please escort our guest out of the building." The two security officers approached cautiously. Harry spun to face them, his eyes wild. "Don't you touch me! Don't you dare put your hands on me!" One of the officers, a tall man with a calm demeanor, spoke softly. "Sir, we're not going to touch you. We're simply going to walk with you to the exit. Please come with us." Harry looked around the studio wildly, as if searching for allies, for someone to back him up. The audience sat frozen. The crew members avoided eye contact. Even his own publicist, standing in the wings, had her face buried in her hands. "This is unbelievable," Harry muttered, yanking off his microphone and throwing it onto the chair. "Absolutely unbelievable. You invite me here, you attack me, and then you throw me out like I'm some kind of criminal." George, still standing near his chair, spoke one last time. "Harry, nobody attacked you. We invited you here for an interview. You chose to turn it into something else entirely. I genuinely hope you get whatever help you might need, but you cannot treat people this way. Title or no title, that's not how we behave." Harry's response was to laugh bitterly, shaking his head. "Help I might need? That's rich coming from you, George. Really rich." He started walking toward the exit, the security officers flanking him at a respectful distance, but he couldn't resist turning back one more time. "You know what the real problem is? People like you have gotten so comfortable being the ones asking the questions that you've forgotten what it's like to be held accountable yourselves. Maybe someone should investigate your life, George. See how you like it." George didn't respond. He simply watched as Harry stormed off the set, the security officers following close behind. The heavy studio doors slammed shut with a resounding boom that seemed to punctuate the entire surreal encounter. For a moment, the studio was completely silent. Then George turned to face the camera, his expression weary but composed. "We're going to take a quick break, folks. When we come back, we'll have the weather forecast and a cooking segment you won't want to miss." The control room cut to commercial, but not before millions of viewers had witnessed one of the most shocking moments in morning television history. George sat back down in his chair, letting out a long breath. A makeup artist rushed over to touch up his face, but he waved her away gently. "I'm fine," he said quietly. "Just give me a minute." The stage manager approached cautiously. "George, are you okay? That was intense." George nodded slowly, running a hand through his hair. "I've interviewed dictators who were more pleasant than that," he said with a slight smile, trying to lighten the mood. But there was no humor in his eyes, only exhaustion and genuine confusion about what had just transpired. In the control room, producers were already on the phone with network executives, trying to explain what had happened and why they hadn't cut away sooner. The footage was already being clipped and uploaded, spreading across social media at lightning speed. Within minutes, hashtags were trending. Within an hour, news outlets around the world were covering the incident. But back on the set, as the commercial break continued, George sat quietly, gathering himself. He had faced hostile interviews before, certainly. He'd dealt with politicians who dodged questions, celebrities who got defensive, and activists who challenged him. But this was different. This wasn't just someone being difficult or evasive. This was a complete emotional breakdown disguised as righteous anger, and it had all been directed at him for simply trying to do his job. A production assistant brought him a bottle of water. He thanked her with a genuine smile, the kind of small kindness that reminded everyone why George had remained a beloved figure in journalism for so long. He treated everyone with respect, from the network executives to the interns who brought him coffee. That's what made Harry's attack so jarring, so undeserved. The floor director counted down 5, 4, 3, 2, and they were back live. George's face transformed back into his professional mask, warm and welcoming, as if the previous segment had been a bad dream. "Welcome back to Good Morning America," he said smoothly. "Now, let's check in with our meteorologists for a look at what weather we can expect this weekend," the show continued. Because that's what professionals do. The weather segment went perfectly. The cooking demonstration was delightful. The next guest interview was pleasant and uneventful. But everyone in that studio knew that this day would be remembered for only one thing: the 37 seconds when a prince lost control and revealed a side of himself that the carefully crafted public relations machine had tried so hard to hide. George conducted the rest of the show with his usual grace and competence. He smiled at the right moments, asked insightful questions, and made his co-hosts laugh during the lighter segments. But those who knew him well could see the slight tension around his eyes. the way his shoulders remained just a bit too rigid. He'd been insulted, threatened, and verbally assaulted on live television, and yet here he was, continuing on like nothing had happened, because that's what the job required. When the show finally wrapped, after what felt like the longest 2 hours in television history, George removed his microphone and stood up slowly. His co-hosts immediately surrounded him, offering support and asking if he was okay. He assured them he was fine, that he'd handled worse, but appreciated their concern. The executive producer pulled him aside for a private conversation. "George, I want you to know that we have your back completely. What happened today was unacceptable, and it's not a reflection on you or your interviewing style. You handled that with more grace than most people could have managed." George nodded, grateful for the support. "I just don't understand what happened," he admitted quietly. "One minute we're starting a routine interview, the next minute he's accusing me of building a career off his suffering. Where did that even come from?" The producer shook her head. "I don't know, but it's not your problem to solve. You did everything right. You were respectful, you tried to de-escalate, you gave him multiple opportunities to reset. He chose to go down that path, not you." As George gathered his things and prepared to leave the studio, staff members approached him one by one to express their support. The camera operators, the sound technicians, the production assistants, they'd all witnessed what happened, and they all agreed that George had handled an impossible situation with remarkable professionalism. Walking through the halls of the ABC building, George reflected on the bizarre encounter. He'd interviewed members of the British royal family before. He'd sat down with Princess Diana years ago when he was still finding his footing as a journalist. He'd spoken with Prince Charles about environmental issues. He'd even had pleasant conversations with Prince William about his charitable work. None of those interviews had prepared him for what happened today. What troubled George most wasn't the personal attacks, though those stung. It was the complete disconnect from reality that Harry had displayed. The idea that simple, straightforward questions about charity work and life in America could be interpreted as some kind of ambush or attack suggested someone who was deeply struggling with something far beyond the scope of a morning show interview. The incident raised questions about celebrity culture, about entitlement, about what happens when someone grows up with immense privilege and then struggles to adjust when that privilege is questioned or challenged. George had seen it before in different contexts: politicians who couldn't handle tough questions, business leaders who expected softball treatment, actors who demanded approval rather than genuine journalism. But this felt different, more raw, more painful to watch. In his office, George finally had a moment to himself. He sat at his desk, staring at the wall where his various journalism awards hung alongside photos from his decades in the industry. He'd covered presidential campaigns, interviewed foreign leaders during international crises, moderated debates that shaped elections, and yet this relatively simple morning show interview had become one of the most challenging moments of his career. Not because of the questions asked, but because of the inexplicable hostility he'd faced for asking them. His phone buzzed constantly. Text messages from colleagues, friends, and fellow journalists poured in, messages of support, expressions of disbelief, questions about what had really happened behind the scenes. George responded to a few, thanking people for their kind words, but mostly he just sat there, processing. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Robin Roberts, his co-host and longtime friend. "Hey," she said softly, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "How are you really doing?" George managed a tired smile. "Honestly, I'm just confused. Did I miss something? Did I say something wrong? I've replayed that interview in my head a dozen times, and I can't figure out what triggered that reaction." Robin sat down across from him. "George, you didn't do anything wrong. Everyone who watched that interview saw what happened. You were nothing but professional and respectful. Whatever he was dealing with, that wasn't about you." "I know," George said, leaning back in his chair. "Logically, I know that. But it doesn't make it any easier to be on the receiving end of that kind of anger, especially when it's completely undeserved." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Robin spoke again. "You know what I think? I think you reminded him of something or someone, and he projected all his frustrations onto you. Maybe it was the questions about his life in America. Maybe it touched a nerve about choices he's made. But that's his issue to work through, not yours." George nodded slowly. "Maybe. I just feel bad for him, honestly. To be that angry, that defensive, that ready to lash out at someone who's trying to have a normal conversation, that's not healthy. That's someone who's struggling. That's what makes you good at this job," Robin said with a warm smile. "Even after everything that just happened, you still have empathy for him. But George, don't let that empathy make you doubt yourself. You conducted that interview exactly the way you should have, with respect, with professionalism, and when things went south, you handled it perfectly." As the afternoon wore on, the full weight of the incident began to settle in. The video clips were everywhere. Social media was ablaze with reactions, takes, and hot opinions. Some people defended Harry, suggesting that the media had pushed him to a breaking point. But the overwhelming majority of responses supported George, recognizing that he'd done nothing to deserve the treatment he'd received. News analysts dissected every moment of the exchange. Body language experts weighed in on Harry's aggressive posture and hostile tone. Communication specialists praised George's de-escalation techniques and professional demeanor. The story dominated the news cycle, overshadowing everything else that had happened that day. But for George, sitting in his office as the sun began to set over New York City, it wasn't about the public reaction or the media analysis. It was about a moment of human connection that had gone terribly wrong. He'd walked into that interview hoping to have a genuine conversation about important topics. He'd wanted to give Harry a platform to discuss his charity work, to share his perspective, to connect with millions of viewers who might benefit from hearing his story. Instead, what should have been a positive, productive conversation had devolved into a spectacle of aggression and entitlement. And while George's reputation remained intact, even enhanced by how he'd handled the situation, he couldn't help but feel sad about the missed opportunity. Not sad for himself, but sad that someone clearly struggling with inner demons had chosen to lash out rather than open up, to attack rather than engage. The thing about live television is that it captures truth in a way that few other mediums can. There are no second takes, no editors to smooth over rough moments, no publicists to spin the narrative. What happened that morning on Good Morning America was raw, unfiltered reality. And that reality revealed something uncomfortable about celebrity culture, about what happens when privilege meets accountability, about the difference between someone who understands their platform as a responsibility versus someone who sees it as a shield. George had interviewed countless celebrities throughout his career. He'd seen the best and worst of human nature play out in those chairs. He'd watched politicians squirm under tough questions, seen actors light up when discussing their craft, observed activists passionately defend their causes, but he'd rarely seen someone so completely unprepared for the basic expectations of civil discourse. The questions he'd asked Harry weren't designed to trap or embarrass. They were the same questions he'd ask anyone in a similar position. How's the transition to American life? What charitable causes are you passionate about? What message do you hope to share with viewers? These weren't hardball journalism questions. They were conversation starters, opportunities for Harry to guide the discussion wherever he wanted it to go. But instead of seizing that opportunity, Harry had seen enemies where there were none, attacks where there was only interest, judgment where there was only curiosity, and in doing so, he'd revealed the deep insecurity and anger that lurked beneath his public persona. It was uncomfortable to watch. Painful even, because it stripped away the carefully maintained facade and showed someone genuinely struggling with their place in the world. George understood struggle. He'd faced his own challenges, his own moments of doubt and frustration. But he'd learned early in his career that professionalism meant maintaining composure even when emotions ran high. It meant treating others with respect even when they didn't reciprocate. It meant doing your job with integrity regardless of the circumstances. That's what separated someone like George from someone like the Harry who appeared on set that morning. One understood that position and privilege came with responsibility. The other seemed to believe they granted immunity from basic standards of behavior. One used their platform to inform and enlighten. The other saw it as a burden to be resented. As George finally prepared to leave his office that evening, he took one last look at the framed photos on his wall. Pictures with presidents and prime ministers, shots from groundbreaking interviews, moments that had defined his career. And he thought about how this moment, this unexpected confrontation with an angry prince, would now be part of that legacy too. But he was okay with that, because when people look back at what happened, they wouldn't remember him as the person who lost his cool or failed to handle a difficult guest. They'd remember him as someone who maintained his dignity and professionalism in the face of unwarranted hostility. They'd see a masterclass in how to handle a situation that had spiraled out of control through no fault of his own. The lights in the office dimmed as George closed the door behind him. The building was quiet now, most of the staff having left hours ago. His footsteps echoed in the empty hallway as he made his way to the elevator. Tomorrow would bring new interviews, new stories, new opportunities to inform and engage with viewers. But tonight, he just needed to go home, decompress, and remind himself why he'd chosen this career in the first place. Because despite the occasional confrontation, Despite the difficult moments and challenging guests, journalism mattered. Holding conversations that informed the public mattered. Giving people a platform to share their stories, even when those stories took unexpected turns, mattered. And George Stephanopoulos, veteran journalist and consummate professional, understood that better than most. The incident would be analyzed and discussed for weeks to come. There would be think pieces about celebrity entitlement, discussions about mental health and public figures, debates about the role of morning show journalism in holding guests accountable. But at its core, what happened that morning was simple. One person tried to have a respectful conversation, and another person chose chaos. Instead, George stepped out into the cool New York evening, the city lights twinkling against the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, Harry was presumably dealing with the fallout from his meltdown, fielding calls from publicists and advisors, perhaps finally recognizing the magnitude of what had transpired. But that was his journey to navigate, his consequences to face, his lessons to learn. For George, the path forward was clear. Show up tomorrow, do his job with the same professionalism and integrity he'd demonstrated for decades, and trust that viewers could see the difference between someone trying to do right and someone who'd lost their way. Because in the end, that's what this moment had revealed most clearly. The difference between grace under pressure and entitlement unleashed. Between a professional at the height of his craft and a celebrity crashing against the rocks of his own making. The morning that started with such promise, a prince visiting a respected news program to discuss his charitable work, had ended with that same prince being escorted off set after a shocking display of hostility and disrespect. It was a cautionary tale about what happens when privilege goes unchecked, when accountability is viewed as an attack, when basic civility is abandoned in favor of performative outrage. But it was also a reminder of why people like George Stephanopoulos matter in media. Because when the unexpected happens, when guests lose control and situations spiral, someone needs to be the adult in the room. Someone needs to maintain standards, uphold respect, and demonstrate that no title or status grants permission to treat others poorly. That morning on Good Morning America, George Stephanopoulos did exactly that. And in 37 seconds of chaos, he reminded millions of viewers what real leadership and professionalism look like, even when facing behavior that defied all reasonable expectations. The studio doors that slammed behind Harry that morning closed not just on an interview gone wrong, but on a moment that would define how we think about celebrity accountability and professional integrity. George walked away from that encounter with his reputation enhanced, his character proven, his worth demonstrated. Harry walked away with questions that only he could answer about who he wanted to be and how he wanted to be remembered. And in the harsh light of public scrutiny, those questions became impossible to ignore.